Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible study this morning. We're going to be talking about the Gospel of John, chapter 11. We've just completed Jesus' ministry at the various feasts, Passover, Tabernacles, and Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication. At the Passover, Jesus talked about being the bread of life in reference to him being the bread from heaven, as they were talking about manna. Feast of Tabernacles, where he said, I am living water. He said, I am the light of the world. And we also talked about the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Hanukkah, where he said, I am the good shepherd, in contrast to the false shepherds that we talked about and read from Ezekiel 34. The Maccabees revolt and the Pharisees of his day we also talked about. If you recall, the Feast of Dedication was a feast that was not a Mosaic feast, but a feast that they began to celebrate as a result of the Maccabean revolt in the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew, where the temple was taken over by a man named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who hated the Jews, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar, spread pig's blood all over everywhere. It was just generally a bad thing, and they took their temple back, and as a result of taking it back, they rededicated it. And as a result of that dedication, they began to celebrate that in their religious holidays. At the Feast of Hanukkah, Jesus completed his public ministry. Not that he will be seen in public, but his ministry to the general public will not include signs of who he is. He's still there. He's still going to be doing miraculous things. He's going to be giving instructions to his disciples. He's going to be, as we see today, he's going to be raising the dead, healing the sick, and all of that. So he just won't be giving signs to the general public. They've had their chance to see his signs in action, and they need to have been developing a belief in following him. All right. In chapter 11, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, not because he is sad for his passing. You know, he's called over there by Mary and Martha, and he was sad, but that is not the reason that he raised him from the dead. But it was to give a foretaste of his coming victory over death, which is the amazing thing, and it's the reason he came, was to save the world. And this is Jesus' most dramatic sign, raising a person from the dead. We serve a miraculous God. Can your faith handle a miracle such as this? To hear about Jesus raising someone from the dead? Can your faith handle the account of creation, where God spoke almost everything into existence in 6 days? Can your faith handle that? That's quite a miracle. What about the things in creation that were created in what we would consider the wrong order? Can it be true? Light was created before the sun. The sun, moon, and the stars were created within an area called, in the Hebrew, it was called the Rakia. Was also related in Scripture to be referenced as sky. Can your faith handle such things as the waters being separated to being above the Rakia and the waters below the Rakia? Can your faith handle that? What is that even talking about? The waters above the Rakia, without even that was, I think it was day 2. It's something that's hard to picture. It may be something that was not quite as easily seen after the flood as it was before when it rained. But nevertheless, can your faith handle that without even understanding it? Okay, our faith should tell us that we do not have to understand everything in the Bible. We just have to accept it as it is written. For we serve a miraculous God. I want to tell you what I said about that in my book, What God Did. It's on page 29. I want to just read this to you, talking about Genesis and the creation. We might say that the writer of Genesis could have written in a manner that is clearer to us, or the translators could have translated into a form that is easier to understand. Easier to understand in plain English? I don't know what that would be. But God specified what the Bible is to say, and furthermore, he specified how it should be said. To change it in any way is to make the Bible the word of man rather than the word of God. On matters not quite understood right now, meaning in our present day as we read it, clarity of thought and understanding will come in due time. We have to accept the things of the Bible on faith. All right, the events of the Bible. We may not understand it. We may say it's not even possible for it to be true. Well, I think the Bible has shown itself to be true at every step of the way, and things will become apparent to us as time goes on. If you have questions about things, if you have questions about events that you read about, like today, for example, the raising of the dead, if you can't resolve it for yourself in Scripture, write it down. Make a mental note of what your question is, and you may just receive a revelation from God in the future as to that very thing. Happens to me all the time in my teaching. All right. Let's get right on into it. Verses 1 through 3 of chapter 11. Now a man named Lazarus was sick, not dead. He was sick. He was from Bethany, a village of Mary and her sister Martha. Parenthetical in verse 2, this Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured her perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. And then verse 3, so the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick, not dead. The one you love is sick. Okay, Bethany. Last week we talked about the end of Jesus' ministry occurring there at the end of chapter 10. And he went back across the Jordan, it says in verse 40, to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days, and there he stayed. And many people came to him, and they believed, and so on and so forth. He went back to the place where he was baptized. And that was, as it turns out, that is very close to Bethany. Bethany was a short walk from Jerusalem. It's about 2 miles, 1.5 to 2 miles. And we'll see this is very important for later. So Lazarus is sick, not dead. He's the brother to Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha were sisters. Martha was probably the oldest, hosting a party for Jesus later in Luke 10, verse 38. We'll look at that someday, but we won't take time to look at that today. And she seems to be the family representative here. It's spoken of, the family spoken of in verse 5. Mary was the special had a special place in another event in Jesus' life. It's spoken of here in verse 2, parenthetically, which we haven't gotten to yet. It doesn't occur until chapter 12, verse 3, where she anointed Jesus with a very expensive perfume. And it's talked about here in verse 2. All right. And then in verse 3, she says, she sent word. This is an important time marker right here. We'll see how it comes into play later, but it says there in verse 3, so the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. The sisters sent word to Jesus. Boom, that's where the time marker starts. Okay. I just want to make a mention to you. Throughout the Gospel of John, John refers to the one who Jesus loved. Some scholars think because of this comment right here, Lord, the one you love is sick, think that probably that reference refers to Lazarus, but I hardly think so. I don't think it does. It's referenced throughout the Gospel of John, and it's what John uses to reference himself. Nevertheless, this shows he loves the family, as we see in verse 5. All right, verse 4. When he heard this, meaning he heard the one you love is sick, meaning Lazarus. When he heard this, Jesus said, red letters, Jesus said this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Okay, Jesus announces that Lazarus will not die, but what? He says a similar thing he said about why the man born blind was born blind, for this healing to be to God's glory. In one of the commentaries I read, the commentary says, not by God's design, not that he caused it, but that God will use it to glorify his Son. That's in the New International Version application commentary. It's found on verse 313 if you care to reference that yourself. Verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. I've already mentioned that. He loves that family, and that's what that verse is all about. And then verse 6 says, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Wow. Your friend is sick. Okay, I think I'll just hang out here for 2 more days. Well, we've got to look at this time, this time marker we saw that I took notice of for you in verse 3. She sent word to Lazarus, to Jesus about Lazarus. It took a day to get there, and Jesus says, well, I'm going to sit here for 2 more. He says he's going to stay here 2 more days. Once he hears of the illness of Lazarus, he stays away 2 more days to get the message. What a curious thing. 1 day to get the message, 2 days delay here makes 3 days total. Note, Jesus' delay does not cause his death. And then Jesus' delay does not cause his death. Verse 7 says, and then he said to the disciples, let's go back to Judea. So 1 more day for travel back to where Mary and Martha are makes 4 days since the day of Lazarus' sickness. So we're talking about 4 days. According to verse 17, it even makes mention of Lazarus has been dead for 4 days when Jesus arrives, which means he died just as the message left, as the messenger left to get the message to Jesus. So there in verse 3 it says, the sisters sent message to Jesus about Lazarus being sick. He died right after that. And then by the time Jesus gets back over there, it's 4 days. 4 days goes by. Okay, let me read verses 8 through 11. But Rabbi, they said, the disciples never called Jesus, Jesus. They never called him by his name. They always call him by titles such as this, but Rabbi, means teacher. Not only does it mean teacher, here it means their teacher. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. Verse 10, it is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. And then verse 11, after he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. Very interesting. I'll just comment here that verses 8 and 9, he makes reference to going back to a place where they tried to stone him. And then he says a very peculiar thing. He makes reference to walking in daytime, in the daylight, walking in the light, versus walking in the darkness. Where, in fact, he says, walking in the daytime, the daylight, for they see by this world's light. He is this world's light. And it is when a person walks in the night that they stumble. They're walking in darkness. So that's what he's talking about. We work while it is daylight. We are active. We are actually actively seeking God, working for God, praising God, praying to God in the light of Jesus. At night, we're in the metaphor of night. We're talking about walking in darkness. And that's what we're talking about, the people that tried to stone him. They're walking in darkness. And then in verse 11, Jesus demonstrates divine knowledge of Lazarus' death, just as he did with Nathanael when he found Nathanael sitting under that, seemed like it was a fig tree. He just knows. Jesus knows these things. All right. Now, verse 12 to 16, let me read that. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. The disciples bonk. They don't quite understand the things Jesus says. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Now we've got it. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, But he's not saying, I'm glad he's dead. He said, I'm glad I was not there for your sake, so that you may believe. But let us go to him now. And then verse 16, then Thomas, remember doubting Thomas, which we're going to see later after the resurrection, after the resurrection. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, so that we know it is that Thomas, said to the rest of the disciples, let us go that we may die with him. Verse 12, the disciples did not understand. Jesus said he's asleep. We need to go wake him up. They did not understand. In verse 14 and 15, Jesus tells them they're going to see a big sign because Lazarus is dead. Jesus does not have have the sense of urgency, meaning he was sick. We got to get over there and save him from dying. He's already dead. There's no hurry in Jesus' mind. You guys need to understand that. There's no hurry. Verse 16, let me read that again. Then Thomas, known to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas is the one who doubts, the doubting Thomas. You've heard of that. Says, let's go. Let's all die together with him, rather than doubt, as he will show in the upper room after the resurrection when he sees Jesus and says, unless I can touch him, touch his wounds, I will not believe. He's the one that let's get right on over there. He's the one that shows courage and faithfulness. How cool is Thomas? My, oh my. Let's look at verse 17 to 20. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had been dead in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And verse 20 says, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lazarus, dead for 4 days. He was in the tomb. There were mourners were there. And Martha meets Jesus on the road as he was coming in. Okay, there's formal mourning was going on, and the practice was for mourning to last for 7 days. Lazarus was probably buried in a tomb, a hewn out tomb with a stone that would roll away to seal it. We're going to see that that's the case. Mourning had begun that same day of his burial, and the family had paid mourners. And these mourners, they get paid to do this. They would come to the home with the family and they would mourn. And I don't mean they were sitting there and sobbing and this sort of thing. They would wail. Wail, and cry out, wail. They were paid to do that. That was the practice, and that's what they did, and that's what was going on as Jesus was on his way over there. When Jesus arrives, the tomb is already sealed with the stone. The extent and passion of the mourning reflects the honor and esteem that Lazarus held in the village. So the louder the mourning, the more honor and respect and esteem that the one who has died had in the community. All right, let's look at verse 21 to 27. Verse 20 said, Martha heard that Jesus was coming. She went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. Verse 21, Lord, of course she didn't call him Jesus. She called him Lord. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you what you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered in verse 24, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. In verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? In verse 27, yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. All right. So in verse 21, Martha met Jesus on the road and said, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. All right, in verse 22, I mean, that's pretty clear. Maybe it's clear. We'll see as we go on. Verse 22 looks like Martha is expecting a miracle. So maybe not so much, right? If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. So it's starting to, in verse 22, it said, but I know that even God now will give you whatever you ask. So kind of looks like she's looking for something. My brother's been dead 4 days, but God will give you what you ask. She doesn't come right out and say it. So let's go on and see if we can come to a conclusion. Resurrection at this point in time, after 4 days in the tomb, you know, there's going to be an odor going on after 4 days of death. Resurrection would be a pretty tall ask after being in the tomb for 4 days. There's going to have to be a pretty strong smell. So what is she asking about? What is she implying? But she definitely is expressing faith in Jesus. Regardless of what she is expecting, she's expecting it through faith in him. In verse 23, Jesus makes a statement to which Martha does not understand based on her response in verse 24. In fact, this verse 24, this right here shows to me that she was not expecting resurrection right now for her brother. She was not. It looked like she was kind of expecting Jesus to do something, but we're looking at verse 24 now. Verse 24 said, Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus had just said in 23, your brother will rise again. That's red letter. Those are his exact words. And then Martha said, rather than say, great, let's do it now, rather than saying that, she said, I know he's going to rise again in the last day. So she's not expecting Jesus to do this right now. And it's important to understand that. In verse 25 and 26, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, I've brought this up before, and I want to bring it up again. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Believe what? You got a lot of things there you could believe. Never die, going to be resurrected. What is this all about? Do you believe this? Look at verse 26. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. So that's another thing. Believing in me, believing you'll never die, believing you'll be resurrected. What is believing what? Believing in me. Believing in me means what? Believing Jesus is the Messiah. So we got to get this straight. When he says, this comes up all the time. We talked about it last week too. If you're believing in me, what are you believing about me? It means you're believing Jesus is the Messiah. Verse 27, Martha's response is, yes, I believe you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Bingo. Martha is getting corrected in verse 25 for her hope that is anchored in the future resurrection to this present experience with Jesus. This is exactly what John 10:10 said. Jesus, I have come to provide for eternity, but I've also come that you may have life right now abundantly, full to overflowing life right now. By believing in Jesus as the Messiah, she is recognizing his authority over death. So he must be the Messiah, the Son of God, because he can do that. I believe you can. I believe you are. This is not a comment that indicates she finally deduces by intellect that he must be the Messiah. It is more like any doubts he might have had have now been removed. Everybody has doubts along the way. We grow in our faith through revelation from God, through experiences that we go through. So any doubts she might have had, like saying, I wonder if he really is, in the back of her mind, those have been removed. All right. Let's look at verse 28 to 33. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here. Again, didn't call him Jesus. Didn't say Jesus is out there. She said, the teacher is here, she said, and he is asking for you. Verse 29, when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus, that probably means she ran. Doesn't say that, but probably means she was excited and she ran out there. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but he was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, those mourners. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. In 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at her feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Then verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. You're going to get a surprise about what he's talking about there, but let's go back now. Martha goes back and calls for Mary, who ran out to meet Jesus. The mourners went too. When they saw the urgency with which she had left, they thought she was going to the tomb. They get paid to mourn; they need to be there too. So they thought they'd follow along. Then in verse 32, many had the same reaction. Mary had the same reaction as Martha when she said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So it's the same reaction. Verse 33 says that she and the mourners were weeping, which sounds almost like quiet tears of sadness, doesn't it? Why would you do anything above a whisper? Just say, I'm sad, I'm weeping to myself. But the Greek actually indicates loud weeping and even wailing. I think I mentioned that once before. There wasn't any subdued weeping and mourning and sadness to yourself. This was loud and easily seen and heard among those around. They were loud displays of grief. They were not weeping quietly to themselves. They were wailing. Verse 33. Now this is going to surprise you. I think it will. Jesus was deeply moved in spirit, and he was also troubled, it says. As we look at it, in spirit, seems easy enough to understand, but the Greek actually means outraged, fury, and anger. These reports, let me read verse 33 again. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He was mad. He was angry at what he saw. Now that is totally surprising when you understand he's going to the place of the death of his friend, whom he loved, the Bible says. It was better than just a friend. It was a deep friend, a good friend. and so were Martha and Mary. And what he saw made him mad. So what could make him mad? How do we look at the death of a loved one? We're sad that they are away from us, but we celebrate knowing the victory they have over death for all eternity, right? If they're believers, that's what we celebrate. But for Jesus, for them, Jesus looked at them as being in a futile situation. They have access to the knowledge of life. They should show a faith that claims victory over the grave. They should have it, but they stand there weeping in defeat. Jesus sees them giving in to defeat, and this makes him angry. Verse 34, I want to read it again. Where have you laid him? Jesus asked. So this is the verse that follows immediately after the one that I just told you of. He was mad at what he saw. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. So Jesus is asking, where is he? Then verse 35 says, Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible. I think it's in there twice. I think later on we'll see as Jesus looked over Jerusalem, he wept, knowing they had rejected their Messiah. But this is the shortest verse as well. Jesus wept. He didn't weep for Lazarus. He knows Lazarus is about to be raised from the dead, and he knows God will be glorified through it. He weeps for the same reason that he showed anger. In verse 33, and he's still weeping about it. These people were living in a futile situation. So let's look at verse 36 through 37. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man alive, kept this man from dying? So we get division again. Some people recognize the depth of love that Jesus had for Lazarus, and some express cynicism. Wasn't very important to him. He should have got, if he's got all this power, he should have been over here saving this guy from dying. So we've got love and hate, same thing we've been seeing all along. Then we get the big event in verse 38 through 44. But let me read 38 through 40. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. That's red letter. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been in there 4 days. There's our reminder. 4 days have gone by since he died, because they bury him on the first day. All right. Then verse 40. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Jesus once more is deeply moved, but he is angry. Here he contrasts his opponent. Here he confronts his opponent. His opponent? Who is his opponent? I don't see anybody after him. I don't see anybody he's fighting with. His opponent is death, and Jesus confronts it. He commands that the stone should be removed. There's a wheel. It wheels in a track, so it's designed to be removed. You roll it over there, you roll it back. Martha is concerned about the odor coming from the decomposition after 4 days. So Here's another indicator that she was not expecting Jesus to do something. You know, when she first met him on the road, we got this feeling she's wanting something extra from Jesus. She's wanting him to do something. We've been showing little bits and pieces along the way, showing that was not her intent at all. And here's another one. He's already dead. He's been dead for 4 days. He stinks. Not expecting Jesus to do anything about it. An interesting point of culture was that they would return to the tomb after 3 days to see if the person is living, like he wasn't really dead, but not raised from the dead, but never dead at all. Not that he would be raised from the dead. It's just the fact that we put him in there when he was still alive. We just didn't realize it. So go check on him. Okay. In verse 45, it's a summary and a reminder of God's glory would be seen through his Son. Again, I ask, believe in what? Verse 40 said, then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Believe what? Believe that Jesus is the Messiah. That's what the belief is in. You believe, that's our call, is to believe in the risen Christ. Theirs was to believe in Jesus as Messiah. But that is a faith call, required then, is required now for us. Verse 41 and 42. So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, red letters, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. That's been the thing Jesus has been trying to get to people to understand and to accept all along. He was sent by God. So this is no last-minute request. The implication is he's already prayed about it. Around the tomb here, he's probably praying in the position assumed for public prayer. He's looking up, hands raised up. He's not praying to impress anybody. He's not praying saying deep down, oh man, I hope this works. He's not praying like that. What have I gotten myself into here? He is praying so that when Lazarus is raised, the people will believe God sent him. If you don't believe God sent him, there's not much else you can believe that's going to matter. Okay? Jesus has a sovereign will, and he can do anything he wants, anytime he wants. It's just that his will and his Father's will always be in agreement. And Jesus will always be obedient to that will. All right, verse 43 and 44. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. It's not hard to imagine sighs of fear and wonder. The dead man walked out of the tomb. And not only that, he was all wrapped up in the stuff they buried him in. There would be sighs. There would be fear, probably. It's a strange occurrence, a strange happening. It's not hard to believe people shrinking back in awe. It's not hard to imagine Jesus being the first to hug his friend. Doesn't say he did. It's not hard to imagine that, though. Jesus comments there, Jesus commands them to remove the grave clothes and let him go. This is a pretty big miracle, or a sign. It is a miracle. Wow, he raised a man dead 4 days to life, walking around life. But more than a miracle, it is a sign. Would your faith allow you to give an account of this event in Jesus' life in front of your unbelieving friends? If you're around your secular friends that are unsaved, could you talk about stuff like this? Raised a dead man? Would you be embarrassed? Would you be afraid of heckling regarding believing in fables? These are just bedtime stories. The point is, we serve a miraculous God. His nature is to do miracles. All right, let's look at 45 and 46. That is the account of the resurrection. But now we're going to get into some aftermath, and you're going to see a prophecy that Caiaphas utters, Caiaphas the high priest utters, and he says it, and I'll bet if he knew the impact it was going to have on people for thousands of years, meaning today, it's still being heard, that it will still be talked about, still be giving glory to Christ and to God, still talking about Jesus being Messiah. If he had known all that, he probably wishes he had never said it. All right, let me read. All right, that's all I have for you this morning. Thank you for studying with me.